Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are plunging into, well, a really critical piece of World War II history. Incredibly tough.
Definitely tough. We're talking about the Winter Line in Italy.
Exactly. A defensive system that just stopped the Allies in their tracks for months.
It really did. Turned a relatively short geographical distance into this long, drawn-out, brutal fight.
So we're going to unpack this today. Our source material is primarily excerpts from Wikipedia.
Right.
And our mission really is to get under the skin of the Winter Line. What was it? How was it put together?
And why was it so darn effective?
Yes. And understand its impact, its huge impact on the whole Italian campaign. It's about getting a real feel for, frankly, a pivotal and very bloody period of the war.
Yeah, it's almost a textbook case, isn't it? How geography and determined defense can just completely shape a military campaign.
Okay, let's unpack this then. First things first, setting the scene. What was the Winter Line fundamentally?
Okay, so the Winter Line, it wasn't just one thing. It was a whole series of German and some Italian military fortifications built right there in Italy during the war.
And who was behind building it?
That would be the organization TOT, the Nazi civil and military engineering group. Pretty infamous.
Ah, right. Them. And the overall command.
Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, he was the German commander-in-chief for Italy. This was kind of his brainchild, his responsibility.
And its specific purpose. The source mentions a particular area it was defending.
Yes, it was focused on defending a western section of Italy. The real strategic heart, though, was centered around the town of Monte Cassino.
Monte Cassino. That name looms large. Why there specifically?
Location, location, location. It crucially blocked Highway 6, and Highway 6 was the main direct route north, straight to Rome.
So control Cassino, control a highway, block the road to Rome.
You got it. It was the bottleneck. And the source is clear. This whole system, this Winter Line, it was considered the strongest of all the German defensive lines south of Rome.
Not just a single trench then. More complex.
Oh, much more. It was designed from the outset as a complex, layered defense, and it really used the Italian terrain, the mountains, the rivers to its absolute advantage.
That layering, that's where it gets really interesting and, I imagine, incredibly difficult for the attackers on the ground. The source breaks it down into, what, three main components?
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. Three main lines or layers. The primary one, the real backbone, was the Gustav Line.
And this Gustav Line wasn't just, like, around Cassino. It was bigger than that.
Much bigger. It stretched right across the Italian peninsula. We're talking from the Tyrrhenian Sea on the west coast, near the mouth of the Grigliano River,
Okay.
right through the Apennine Mountains, the really rugged spine of Italy, all the way over to the Adriatic coast in the east, ending near the Sangro River mouth.
Wow. So that effectively slammed the door on both the main Allied armies pushing north, the U.S. Fifth Army in the west, and the British Eighth Army in the east.
Exactly. It barred the way for both. The Allied plan back in autumn 43, it had the Eighth Army trying to punch through on the east near the Sangro, then hook inland towards Avezzano, aiming to get at Rome from the rear.
While the Fifth Army pushed from the south.
Right. But the Gustav Line just sat right across both of those intended paths, blocked them cold.
And you mentioned Monte Cassino earlier. That western end of the Gustav Line seems particularly crucial, thinking about the terrain.
Absolutely vital. The line literally crossed Highway 6 right near Casino Town. It followed the Liri Valley, and then it was anchored by these imposing mountains looming right behind the town.
And the key feature there?
The high ground. You had the ancient Benedictine Abbey, the sanctuary, and the actual peak of Monte Cassino itself sitting right there, dominating the valley entrance.
Giving the defenders just perfect observation over anyone trying to move up that valley, like looking down from a balcony.
Precisely. Unobstructed views. It meant they could call down artillery, mortar fire, anything, with pinpoint accuracy on any Allied movement below. It was a natural strong point made even deadlier by fortifications.
Okay, Gustav Line, the main shield. But you said layers. What about the other lines mentioned?
Right, so supporting the Gustav Line, mainly on that crucial western side, you had two other named lines, the Bernhardt Line and the Hitler Line.
Okay, Bernhardt and Hitler. Where did they sit relative to Gustav?
So the Bernhardt Line was generally in front of the main Gustav positions. It was kind of the outer layer, the first major hurdle the Allies hit on that western approach.
Right.
The Hitler Line, though, that was positioned further back, about 8 kilometers, maybe 5 miles behind the Gustav Line.
So like a fallback position, insurance.
Exactly that, a reserve line. The source explains that both these lines, Bernhardt and Hitler, they didn't run the full width like Gustav. They ran shorter distances inland from the Tyrrhenian coast and then sort of merged into the main Gustav Line just northeast of Cassino.
Creating that defense in depth on the critical western flank.
Precisely. Layers.
Now, you touched on something interesting there. The source mentions that sometimes these lines get defined differently.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point the source brings up. It's not always cut and dried. Some historians might define the Bernhardt Line as extending further, maybe even coast to coast, incorporating defenses. Others might just call part of the Eastern Gustav Line. And sometimes you'll even see the term Winter Line used almost interchangeably with just the Gustav Line, even though technically the Winter Line system included Bernhardt and Hitler too.
So the terminology can be a bit fuzzy.
It can be, and it's a good reminder actually when we study history. Pinning down exact names and extents for these sprawling, evolving military positions, it's not always simple. Definitions can shift. It's definitely something to keep in mind as we dig into the impact.
Okay, so you've got these layers, Bernhardt out front, Gustav is the main course, Hitler behind, and all of this is built into that really difficult Italian geography, mountains, rivers, narrow valleys. It sounds like it was designed to be incredibly tough to break. What were the actual fortifications like?
Oh, they were serious. We're not talking about simple trenches here. The source mentions things like deep gun pits, proper concrete bunkers.
Hardened positions.
Very much so. Turreted machine gun emplacements, think like small tank turrets set in concrete, very hard to knock out from the front. Then you had vast stretches of barbed wire and, crucially, extensive minefields covering pretty much anywhere the Allies might try to advance.
So designed to channel attackers into kill zones and just make movement hellish.
Exactly. Turn those natural choke points into man-made death traps.
And the manpower holding this line, how many troops did the Germans commit?
The source estimates about 15 German divisions were deployed along the Winterline system at various points. That's a significant number of soldiers dedicated to holding this ground across that huge, challenging front.
Given all the layers, the terrain, the fortifications, the troops, it's maybe not shocking that breaking through takes such a long time and costs so much. How long did it actually take the Allies?
Months, a really long, grinding struggle. The source says it took the Allies basically from mid-November 1943 all the way through to June 1944 to fight their way through all the different parts of the Winterline system.
Wow, November 43 to June 44, that's more than half a year.
Yeah, just for that section of Italy.
Which battles really stand out as being directly tied to fighting through the Winter Line?
Well, the most famous, almost symbolic one has to be Monte Cassino. The source really highlights the bloody and protracted nature of that fight. The battle for the mountain, the abbey, the town, the valley.
And the U.S. Fifth Army got stuck there all winter.
Pretty much halted right in front of it through the winter of 43-44. That high ground, controlled by determined defenders, was just incredibly difficult to take.
And the Allies tried to go around it, didn't they? With
Yeah.
landings further up the coast.
They did. That was the Anzio landing. The idea was to outflank the Winter Line, force the Germans to pull back. But, as the source puts it, that landing also bogged down quickly.
So instead of a quick flanking move, it became another isolated, costly battle.
Exactly. The Germans contained the beachhead, counterattacked fiercely, and Anzio turned into its own major slugfest, not the quick solution they'd hoped for.
What about on the other side of Italy? The eastern side, with the British Eighth Army.
Over on the Adriatic side, you had the battle for Ortona. That was in December 43. Incredibly fierce fighting in the town itself, captured by Canadian forces. It got nicknamed the Little Stalingrad because the fighting was so intense, house to house, street to street.
Brutal.
Yeah. But even after taking Ortona, the source notes that the Eighth Army couldn't take the nearby town of Orsonia. And that failure was a big factor in stalling their whole advance on the eastern flank against the Gustav Line proper.
So the line was holding firm center, west-east, right through that whole winter period. What were the main reasons things didn't really break open for the Allies until the spring of 44?
The source points to a few key things that really worked in favor of the German defense, beyond just the fortifications themselves. First, the weather. Terrible weather. Constant heavy rain flooded rivers. It turned the valleys into quagmires. Made movement, especially for vehicles and supplies, incredibly difficult.
Yad, the great equalizer.
Absolutely. Then there were the sheer number of casualties the Allies took in those initial assaults. Very high losses, which inevitably slowed things down. And while there were some command changes on the Allied side, like Montgomery leaving, the fundamental problem remained the strength of the Winterline itself and that awful terrain.
So looking back, from the German perspective, did Kesselring achieve what he set out to do with this line?
You'd have to say yes, largely. The source states his main goal was to keep the Allies south of Rome for as long as possible, make them pay for every yard. And the Gustav Line, the heart of the Winter Line, definitely did that. It effectively slowed the Allied advance for all those months, December 43 right through to June 44.
A costly success for the Germans in terms of achieving that delay.
Yes, a delay bought at a huge price for the attackers.
And speaking of price, the human cost. It must have been immense.
Staggering. The source gives some figures just for the major battles we mentioned, Monte Cassino and Anzio. You're looking at around 98,000 Allied casualties
98,000.
and about 60,000 Axis casualties. So combined, close to 160,000 men killed or wounded just in those two battles alone, fighting over what is geographically not a huge distance. You know, what's really fascinating when you step back and look at it, it's how the German command orchestrated this whole thing. It wasn't just one static line. It was these distinct layers, Bernhardt, Gustav, Hitler, all integrated into the single, really formidable Winterline system.
Not just isolated strong points, but a connected defense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Designed to work together, to be mutually supporting, and they masterfully used Italy's own geography against the attackers, those mountains, the river valleys, even the coastlines, leveraging every natural obstacle to create maximum resistance.
Turning the landscape itself into a weapon almost.
You could definitely say that. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, the wider war, this wasn't just about stubbornly holding ground for its own sake. It was a deliberate strategy by Kesselring. The goal was to gain time, crucial time, and bleed the Allied forces dry.
Inflict maximum cost.
Inflict maximum cost, yeah. And by delaying the capture of Rome for over 6 months, it absolutely impacted the allocation of Allied resources, troop movements, the whole timetable for the Italian campaign, and maybe even influenced timings elsewhere in Europe.
So why should this story of the Winter Line matter to you listening to us now?
Well, I think it's a really powerful illustration, isn't it? It shows how determined defense, smart use of fortifications, and especially challenging geography can completely change the equation of war. It demonstrates how a relatively short distance on a map can translate into months and months of absolutely brutal attritional fighting on the ground.
It really highlights the value placed on controlling those key choke points.
Immense value. Places like the Liri Valley, Highway 6, controlling them was everything. And the Winter Line shows the horrific human price that both sides were willing to pay or forced to pay for that control.
So summing it up, the Winter Line, a really sophisticated, multi-layered defensive system. It brilliantly used Italy's tough geography, and it succeeded in its objective, delaying the Allied push to Rome for many costly months. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into what was truly a critical and very difficult chapter of the Second World War.
And maybe one final thought to leave you with, picking up on that point about definitions we mentioned earlier. You know how the source notes that terms like Bernhardt Line or even Winter Line versus Gustav Line aren't always used consistently by historians.
Right, that fuzziness.
Yeah. What does that slight ambiguity tell us? Perhaps it highlights the challenge, of neatly labeling complex, sprawling, dynamic things like military front lines or even historical events as they unfolded. It's maybe a little reminder that even terms that seem factual and concrete can have layers of interpretation shaped by different perspectives or the specific focus of the historian. Something to think about.
A very interesting point. Definitely food for thought. We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.